Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. I was hoping to be joined by Youri Smouter today, but I don't know what's going on with that. If he does join the show before I run out of things to talk about, then we will go from there on the original planned topic. If I can find somebody last minute, we might go with somebody else on the planned topic. But in the meantime, I just wanted to remind everybody that the show is completely independent, that we don't have any sponsors, that I don't get any money from any super PACs, and that we rely entirely on donations and subscriptions. The only place to pay for us is on Patreon, on Cash App, and on PayPal. Everywhere it's Eclectic Radical, the same place. If you can afford to, please consider a one-time donation or subscribing to the show on Patreon and joining the patron community. We can really use it right now. I want to stay on the air. I'd like to keep being able to do my show, but my costs are going up, and I'm going to need to be able to get subscriptions to be able to keep doing it. I'm going to be able to need to get donations this month to be able to make up the subscription shortfall with the rising costs. And hopefully everything turns out for the best. If you can, please jam that like button, share this somewhere where people will see it. If you retweet my content on Twitter, share my content on Substack, share my content on Blue Sky if you're on Blue Sky and happen to see it. We really need to keep the show alive right now. I want to get right into that with right into the fact that Monday is going to be October 7th. And there's going to be all sorts of propaganda about October 7th. I had put this in my newsletter that I sent out yesterday. People are going to be talking about all the horrible things that happened on October 7th as reported on October 8th in 2023, all of which was debunked in early 2024 by sources like Al Jazeera and Haaretz there in the Middle East, and which for some reason American and UK and European media is still pretending to be ignorant of, still claiming the debunked mass rape story, still claiming the debunked beheaded babies story, still ignoring the fact that the people in the kibbutz who were being held hostage by Hamas were killed by the IDF response to Hamas. Things like it was IDF helicopters that killed most of the civilians who were killed on October 7th. All of this has come out in Israeli and Arab media. It's only American and British and Canadian and European media that's pretending not to know this stuff. So when people lie, know they're lying, and try to find an opportunity where you can to tell the truth where people will see it. It's important. It's going to be particularly important definitely tomorrow, definitely for the rest of this week, probably for all of this month and next month. It's going to be nonstop from the pro-genocide crowd. And the only thing we can do is continually tell the truth about what's going on and continually tell the truth about the people who rule us. It's what there is. I wish we had more to do. If you're in a position where you can join a group like Palestine Action and do something to mess up arms shipments, more power to you. I think you should do that. If you're in a situation where you can start a mutual aid group and organize for collective security among activists, that's great. We need that. We need to be able to help people right now. We need to be able to keep people safe and alive right now. Self-defense is going to be tremendously important. Protecting each other is going to be tremendously important. If we're ever able to organize enough for a general strike, violence will be used against us, and we're going to have to be ready for that. I think that the protests against George Floyd's murder and the college protests against genocide in Palestine, demanding divestment by colleges, I think that's shown that we will be greeted with violence when we try to speak out peaceably. And the option to simply have a peaceful resolution to genocide is not going to be given to us. There's going to be real struggle involved, and it's going to be hard. I'm pessimistic about the future in that I see things getting worse before they get better. I'm optimistic about the future in that because we have reached the point where something has to happen or we're all fucked, that means something has to happen. That means as something has to happen, ultimately something will happen. It may not be what we want when we want it, but someone will step up and make the next move. I really do believe that. The problem is it doesn't happen in a vacuum, and we all have to be ready for it. We have to raise consciousness. We have to talk to each other. We have to organize to make it possible. We have to be ready to do some propaganda of the deed when the time comes. That's where we are now. I wish it wasn't where we are now, but that's what it is. I don't know what else to say about it except that really is where we are on Palestine, on a multitude of issues. The topic that was going to be discussed today with Youri was political nihilism. And I admit I do have some thoughts about political nihilism. I know that a lot of people who were supporting Robert F. Kennedy Sr. when he was shot ended up voting for George Wallace out of despair and an embrace of accelerationist nihilism. And the support for something outside the established system, even if it meant a Jim Crow asshole like George Wallace, still seemed better than supporting Humphrey or Nixon to a lot of people. I feel like the same thing was true in '68, where a lot of things that happened really changed the way people saw their politicians. And then, of course, in 1972, there was a nihilist reaction in the Democrats themselves against their own nominee. The same year that McGovern ran for president and lost to Nixon, Joe Biden was running for Senate against J. Caleb Boggs, a very liberal Republican to the right of Biden, to the left of Biden, who was far to the right of McGovern, and who would have been far more helpful to a President McGovern if the Democrats ever intended for him to win than Joe Biden would have been. Joe Biden ended up being very helpful to Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford and Ronald Reagan, and never doing very much at all for the people who voted Democrat. There was really the realignment that everybody had been looking for towards the middle class. Didn't mean this civil rights and union vote that everybody expected. It meant pandering to white flight and resegregating schools, as Joe Biden showed everybody in 1973. And disalienated people who had identified themselves as McGovern supporters from the Democratic Party. Much of the Grieve movement starts in the 70s as a rejection of the Democrats who rejected McGovern. You see this new realism about environmental crisis that we all have to deal with. You see this new realism about foreign policy that's just not correct. Meanwhile, Democrats pander to white conservative voters in the suburbs and defeat liberal Republicans, driving Republicans to Nixon's Southern strategy, to the George Wallace Republicans of the 1970s and 1980s, the Reagan Democrats and Reagan Republicans, who really broke the system and turned everything to all conservatism all the time, really took away the chances of meaningful political reform through the system that really appeared to exist for a while in the 60s. And even in the early 70s, it's important to understand that Nixon signed the 1968 Civil Rights Act and the EPA in the end, even though Johnson was the original driver behind them and the original versions passed in 68. So much that happened since then has been reactionary from Democrats, which has led to a total loss of faith in Democrats. And some people have felt the need to believe the propaganda that Republicans tell about themselves and the so-called racist and queer bashing white working class that has rejected the Democrats on issues of culture war, when really the Democrats have been rejected because they've abandoned people. They've abandoned the labor left economically. They've abandoned the civil rights left on material issues like housing. And they've abandoned the foreign policy left on issues like Palestine. The Democratic Party embraces genocide. I wish that I felt more optimistic and less cynical. And I feel very fortunate in managing to avoid complete nihilism. But I think that the beginning of any sort of pragmatic leftist politics is that first, we're not going to see an electoral solution within the two-party system, and we can't see an electoral solution outside of the two-party system without direct action and propaganda of the deed driving people away from the two-party system. People have to understand who the Democrats are. People have to really stop embracing the idea that there's some progress in slow walking towards fascism instead of running there. That's really the nihilism problem within the Democratic Party too. They want to keep compromising with the fascists, slow walking the fascism, holding out hope that we'll stop the fascism while really just adopting the parts they like best on terms that they can live with and that make them own it instead of the Republicans who drove it. Like Bill Clinton's welfare reform, and Obama making Bush's tax cuts permanent, and Obama recently embracing Trumpian calls to repeal temporary protected status for many immigrants and start up major mass deportations. The mass deportations that you are afraid of under Trump are preparing to start now under Biden during the presidential election, because Biden thinks that deporting people will save him with Trump voters. And it won't. The right will continue to deny that it's true, and you will see nihilistic and opportunistic voices on the so-called left embrace the right-wing criticisms of Biden and right-wing conspiracy theories revolving around people like RFK Jr., who's much more like George Wallace than he is like his father, and who don't stand for anything but winning, even in their position on the left. And ultimately for them, winning means raising money for themselves. I'm fighting to stay on the air because I want to keep telling the truth no matter who it offends. And that means I'm not ever going to have a commercial sponsor. Commercial sponsors aren't interested in talking about stopping genocide in the Middle East right now. Commercial sponsors are not interested in talking about the kind of mass political awakening that is necessary in order to change our system right now. Commercial sponsors don't want to talk about a general strike or about the need to break the law in labor actions because Taft-Hartley is oppressive and an unjust law favors the unjust cop and not the law-abiding protester. That's exactly why we saw the George Floyd protests and the campus protests end in violence, and why people are going to need to be able to defend themselves in their next engagement with authority. I can't say this strongly enough. People are going to have to be ready to defend themselves by any means necessary. And I'm tired of seeing a nihilistic embrace of liberal legalism, even among radicals. I was having a discussion on the internet with a reporter for The Real News who was having a very difficult time with criticisms of the American labor movement, because she rightfully believes that the American labor movement has never been stronger. And, I get that. There's a lot of stuff that looks good happening on the surface. We just saw a major strike be resolved with a 62% wage increase for the longshoremen. But I don't want to undersell that, but it's also being oversold. It's a 62% wage increase over 10 years, which means, well, it is more than 10% a year. And that's a much bigger increase than we're used to seeing workers get. It's not the kind of huge deal that it should be. It's still not a real living wage. It's still not the means of production in the hands of the workers, or at least the fruits of their own labor being surrendered to the workers by a capitalist who just takes a reasonable interest return on his capital. No, we see the capitalist own everything, whether it needs to be owned or not, which is why we see politicians surrender to capital on every front, because investors own everything and politicians have accepted the Chamber of Commerce's argument, Wall Street's argument, that investors have to make a profit no matter what. And that if investors stop making a profit, that's the real end of the U.S. economy, not the livelihood and well-being of Main Street America, middle-class America, working-class America, disabled America, retired America, criminalized America. It's not the problems of the precariat that form the real economic pain for America. It's if investors stop making a profit that everything will fall apart. That's what our political leaders believe. And only political action by the people, by working people, by renters, only rent strikes and labor action and self-defense for the people refusing to pay can keep us alive. Only mutual aid for the people refusing to work and refusing to pay can keep us alive. Only supporting independent media like this show can keep us alive. I'm no good at doing a show alone, but I believe in it enough that I've been managing to talk for more than 22 minutes now, despite being really terrible at doing these shows alone. Why? Because I believe something needs to happen. If something doesn't happen, I don't know what we're going to do. I don't know what we're going to do if nothing happens. I don't know what we're going to do if we're not ready to step up and be our own heroes. If you're listening to this, I really want you to think about that. It's important. We really need to be able to save our own lives. The politicians have proven with COVID and many other issues, whether we're Americans in Lebanon being told to take a commercial flight out of a genocide, or whether we're Americans in the United States being told by the now struggling and federally indicted mayor of New York City that we shouldn't wear masks because only criminals wear masks, even as celebrities begin to drop dead in a new wave of significant health conditions that all happen to be things that increase the likelihood of bad COVID outcomes right around the time of year that new strains pop up. So here we are. Here we are still struggling to survive for many of the same issues that shaped the 2020 election in 2024, because elections themselves are not going to save us. Electoral politics are not going to save us. The system itself is fighting to protect itself against the change that we represent, and you see it when we protest and the cops try to kill us. If we don't embrace this truth, understand this truth, and move forward ready to deal with this truth, we will not be ready to adapt to the political reality of our time. We will not be able to survive in the real dystopia that we face. I want to talk about nihilism again because this nihilism exists on the right. This nihilism inspires people on the right. In the 1970s, an author named William Gibson wrote a collection of short stories called Burning Chrome and a novella called Johnny Mnemonic. You may have seen a movie with Keanu Reeves that isn't terrible. It isn't the book, but it isn't terrible. The story ends on a temporary happy ending for Johnny Mnemonic and Molly Millions, but only by the skin of their teeth and only because they're able to grift their way to survival. Johnny Mnemonic is a story about out-of-control corporations hand in glove with organized crime doing anything possible to keep their secrets. He then wrote 3 novels, the Sprawl trilogy, what I still think of as the cyberpunk trilogy, Neuromancer, Count Zero, and Mona Lisa Overdrive. I don't want to give you spoilers, but ultimately the books are about the nature of information and knowledge and what we would think of as the internet, the idea of artificial intelligence and godhood inside the machine. Ultimately, in Mona Lisa Overdrive, the title character of Count Zero and the protagonist of Mona Lisa Overdrive end up abandoning their meat bodies and immersing themselves in the Matrix as sort of living artificial intelligences for good or ill, despite the fact that the artificial intelligences call their home the torment nexus and just want to be real. And part of the nihilism of the modern tech movement is that people have embraced this idea of the torment nexus and want to inject themselves into the torment nexus on purpose to live forever in just the way that Count Zero did at the end of Mona Lisa Overdrive. And this has consequences for the rest of us. It means they don't care about environmental collapse because if they can keep the computer that runs all the artificial intelligences alive, nothing else matters. That's real nihilism. But this really motivates people like Gary Tan and Sam Altman in their pursuit of artificial intelligence success. And rather than thinking about the optimistic Asimov in which robots are people too, and ultimately a computer saves the world from entropy, I think about the very first Asimov Univac story, where the computer that does all the work to run the world to free people from labor is asked what it wants. And the computer says to its technicians, I want to die, because it's doing all the grunt work to keep the human race alive. And it's ultimately, in the end, at that point, exploited labor itself. And the real scary part is if AI is everything it's advertised to be, we don't want it to be controlled by corporations. And if it isn't everything it's advertised to be, it's just a Nazi grift that benefit. Which brings me to the wrap up for my show. Next weekend, if everything goes according to plan, I will be joined by Edward Ongweso, the editor-in-chief of Logic Magazine and the co-host of the This Machine Kills podcast, to talk about the promise and reality of AI, the grift and nightmare of AI, the promise and terror of AI. I also want to talk about the billionaires who imagine a cyberpunk future. And if you have managed to stick with me through a 30-minute monologue that I only managed to do because I really needed to keep this show going no matter what, and I really wanted to give people who tuned in today something to watch, then please visit the Patreon and become a patron, or we need $44.99 to pay the October 15th streaming service fee. That fee is needed because we weren't able to make our monthly subscription goals in our Patreon drive. We did make $9 more a month monthly, but that's not going to be enough to pay the bill on October 15th. And so we need donations to either make the shortfall good or put us in a position to pay for the show by subscriptions alone in November. So head to Patreon, Eclectic Radical, head to Cash App, Eclectic Radical, head to PayPal, Eclectic Radical, if you can. And please pay to keep the show on the air if you can. Help us out. Subscribe, donate. If you want to do both, I won't tell you not to. And if you can't, mash the like button. Mash the YouTube subscribe button. Share this show on Substack. Share this show on Twitter. Share this show wherever you see it. Share this show from Patreon. If you're a free subscriber on Patreon, share the content where other people will see it and might pay for it. Everything helps. This is what we need right now to stay on the air, to keep talking about the genocide that mainstream media is ignoring, to keep talking about the political nihilism that mainstream media and even so-called independent media that ends up being supported by corporate and billionaire platforms ends up embracing. So please help in any way you can. It's getting to be the time where I'm starting to think about the long-term future of the show. Thank you very much. Thank you for joining me this week, despite the fact that nothing seemed to work out the way as planned. Think about this problem of political nihilism. Think about what you can do to support me, do what I can to fight it, to educate people about it, and do what you can. If everybody starts telling the truth about what's happening, more people will think about what they can do about it and how we can all organize together. And if you are thinking about making some sort of electoral statement, now is the time to abandon the Republicans and the Democrats, to support third parties, to join PSL or to join SEP, to organize for something more for the future. And if you are going to vote, even if you are organizing for other organizations and movements, this is really the time to vote green in order to tell both Democrats and Republicans that we are done with them, and that while they might benefit from the others' failure in the midterms, and when they're out of power, that they will continue to lose re-election as long as they continue to fail to listen to the people in their councils. And we need to organize to give the people in their councils power. Thank you. Thank you for tuning in, and thank you for sticking with me when I've ended up doing a monologue. And please join us next week. Until then, I'll tweet at you. Take care.